Madam President, some of you at home may be old enough to remember a distinct circular scar on your upper arm. You may remember a parent or grandparent who had one. That mark was probably one of the world's greatest public health successes, the eradication of the deadly smallpox virus. That so many alive today no longer remember the death and misery caused by this disease is a testament to global efforts in a cooperative manner. The smallpox virus likely originated more than 3,000 years ago and was one of the most devastating diseases ever in the history of humanity. It was barely visible under the most powerful microscope and was known for fiery bumps covering the face and body, profuse internal bleeding, black vomit, and pieces of destroyed skin that would shed off one's body. Smallpox is estimated to have killed up to 300 million people in the 20th century. 300 million, and around 500 million in the last 100 years of its existence. In 1967, the World Health Organization launched an historic, intense effort to eradicate smallpox. The global eradication effort initially used a strategy of mass vaccination to achieve 80% vaccine coverage in each country, and thereafter using contact tracing, familiar with the word, to reduce and rein in additional outbreaks. Ultimately, the global eradication of smallpox was certified and endorsed in 1980, making it one of the most successful collaborative public health initiatives in the history of the world. In fact, this month marks the 40th anniversary of the World Health Organization's historic achievement, the end of smallpox. Similar global efforts have been taken to deal with diseases such as polio and Ebola. So imagine my concern, and that of the rest of the world, that amid the devastating global coronavirus pandemic, the United States decided just recently to sit out a conference to collaborate and raise funds to research, manufacture, and distribute a possible coronavirus treatment and vaccine. Just as with the smallpox effort, such a global collaborative approach makes sense, being both morally and strategically the thing to do to save lives around the world. You see, joining forces with other countries would help speed the development and eventual distribution of a coronavirus vaccine that we all desperately seek. It would save lives in America, but it would also save lives around the world. No one knows where the vaccine will eventually be perfected or produced. So we should be in on this. The United States should be at the table. We should be part of the collective global effort to find this vaccine. Clearly, other world leaders get it. They understand the obvious imperative of raising $8 billion to be spent over the next 2 years. $8 billion is a massive sum of money until you place it up against the price we are currently paying for this virus. Our allies in the European Union and Norway came to this table that the United States vacated or refused to attend, and each pledged $1 billion toward this $8 billion goal. Who was absent from this critical effort to save lives around the world, including lives in the United States? Sadly, it was the United States itself. We were not part of this virtual global conference. You see, in yet another short-sighted and critically missed opportunity to address the coronavirus, a question about what this administration was thinking. Why were we missing in action when all these countries came together? I don't know where this vaccine will be found. It'd be a great source of pride if it's the United States, and I have the greatest confidence in the men and women who are researchers and businesses prepared to produce and develop. I have the greatest confidence in them. But what if the very safest vaccine, the most effective vaccine, the one that is proven to be the best, comes instead from England or Germany? Does that mean we won't use it because it's not the American vaccine? We know better than that. We want the safest, most effective vaccine wherever it may come from, to be available to the world and certainly to the United States of America. Supporters in Congress said little or nothing when it came to the decision to vacate and to not be present at this international conference. The president has blamed others for problems that we face today, but it was his decision not to participate in this global conference on the vaccine. It could have devastating consequences. So what does it mean for America? Well, we continue to have some of the world's best researchers, experts at the National Institutes of Health, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, and many universities and private researchers that work across the country and around the world. Many NIH-funded researchers have spent years studying coronaviruses. Their knowledge could help to pave the way for future breakthroughs. I applaud them, and I have to tell you, for the last 4 or 5 years, there has been a quartet of senators of both political parties who have given dramatic investments to the National Institutes of Health for additional research. We've been led by Roy Blunt, the Republican chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee, as well as Lamar Alexander, the Republican chair of the Health and Education Committee. Patty Murray has always been in the forefront of this effort, and I've done my best to back them up every way possible. We've had a 30% or more increase over the last 4 years in research at the NIH. So I believe in the NIH, and I've made it a major part of the job that I've undertaken here in the United States Senate with my bipartisan colleagues. Clinical trials we know are underway at NIH for vaccines. I want to commend that agency. Dr. Fauci, a friend of more than 20 years, and Dr. Collins, the same, for their tireless, unwavering, and inspired effort. But it's plausible, as I mentioned earlier, that the best vaccine candidate may turn up in some other country, not in the United States. It'll be some overseas company that decides to initiate and lead the production of the vaccine. In a rush to research and validate a vaccine, ramp up production, address global allocation and supply needs, and ensure affordability and access worldwide, where will the United States stand? In the fray, in the battle, or on the sidelines? Last week, we decided to stay on the sidelines and not to work with global partners to find this vaccine. When the United States pursues a go-it-alone approach while the rest of the world is working together, where does that leave us? That's why last week, Senator Schumer, Murray, Leahy, Menendez, Murphy, Duckworth, and nearly 3 dozen others joined me in introducing a straightforward resolution that calls on the United States to join these global efforts. I'm grateful to organizations like PATH, Shot at Life, Better World Campaign, and the UN Association of the United States for their support of this resolution as well. Quite simply, we should be part of these efforts to not only offer American expertise, but to share in life-saving benefits. We used to have a profound, well-documented, proud bipartisan history of such effort. For example, I was pleased to rally around President Bush's call to stem the scourge of AIDS around the world through the historic PEPFAR program. Many of my Republican colleagues in the Senate supported these efforts. Now we face this coronavirus outbreak. I was equally proud of President Obama's efforts to set up infectious disease prevention systems and his leadership on the Ebola crisis. Madam President, I've been told that one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle is going to object to enacting this resolution this morning. I want to read the resolution clause that this colleague will be objecting to. I want those who are following this debate to ask whether or not they find this objectionable. Here's what it says. Calls on the United States government to boost funding for and strengthen collaboration with key multilateral institutions at the forefront of responding to COVID-19, such as the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and the Solidarity Trial. This is not a radical or partisan suggestion. We did our best to make it nonpartisan, because it should be. Does anyone in this country care if the researcher who finds that vaccine is a Republican or a Democrat? I certainly don't. And we shouldn't care either, whether it's found in the United States or another country. I'd be so proud if it's found here, but if there is a safe and effective vaccine found in another country, we certainly want to participate in its discovery, its production, and its distribution. To stand on the sidelines at that point in history would be disastrous. Madam President, last Friday I was driving from Chicago to St. Louis, Chicago to Springfield. It's about a 3-hour and 15-minute ride. Had plenty of time in that rental car to listen to a lot of radio, but it was interrupted by the president, who in a press conference made it clear to us that he was going to address the need for this global vaccine, as he said, at warp speed. I've disagreed with this president on a lot of things, but I sure don't disagree with that statement. The sooner we can find it, the better. And I want the United States to use all of its resources to make it happen. The president was asked in a press conference afterwards what that meant in terms of sharing this vaccine with the world, and he said, we'll do it. It was a simple statement. There was no reservation. He made a pledge right then and there that if we discover this vaccine, it will be shared with the world. Thank you, Mr. President. That was the right thing to say at the right moment, as the whole world was watching to see the United States leadership. What I'm calling on in this resolution is simply that we use our expertise and an investment, and we make investments every day in global efforts, that we use this for a collaborative effort, a global effort to find this vaccine. As I said from the beginning, it'll be a great source of pride if it's found here. But if it isn't, if there's a safer, more effective vaccine that is available and it's discovered in another country, what difference does it make if it saves lives in America and around the world? Let's be part of this effort. Let's set our pride aside and instead talk about the impact it would have on this globe and on the people today who are in fear, suffering, and sadly dying as a result of this global virus. And so, Madam President, I ask unanimous consent, as if in legislative session, that the Committee on Foreign Relations be discharged from further consideration of S. Resolution 579 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
Senator from Idaho.
Madam President, reserving the right to object, let me say that the resolution referred to by my friend from Illinois is comfortably residing in the Foreign Relations Committee at the present time and is subject to the regular order of Congress and of the committee. There's almost nothing that the senator said that I disagree with, although from time to time I do disagree with my good friend and colleague from Illinois. I think that this is a matter that is of most serious consequence to the United States of America today. And certainly the pursuit of a vaccine and or a cure are of utmost importance. I think that the process by which we go through that is incredibly important. Like Senator from Illinois, I am a huge fan of the NIH and, for that matter, the CDC, who do great things for the public health system in not only America, but in the world. They're vastly underappreciated. They're much like the electric switch in our rooms that every morning we get on and we get up and turn on the electricity and everything's fine. We just take it for granted and don't even think about it. And that's true of the NIH and the CDC. They do good work regardless of whether we're thinking about it or not. But in America, we have something more than just a government effort when it comes to public health. We have this great machine called the free market and free enterprise system that incentivizes Americans through the private sector, to do great and glorious things. Indeed, while my good friend from Illinois was bragging on the efforts by other countries to pursue the kinds of things that are needed, within the last 24 hours, we've had a very important announcement from part of our private sector who are making great strides in this regard. I think it's important that we do accept that there are various ways that we can and should pursue the vaccine and the cure for this horrible scourge. This matter is a lot deeper than that. It is the intent of our committee to hold hearings and develop very comprehensive legislation regarding how we pursue this in the future. What's just recently happened to us is of great interest to all of us, but not nearly as important as to what's going to happen to us in the future. The Senate Res 579, there are parts of it, if not the vast majority of it, that I hope will be included when we get to what hopefully will be a comprehensive piece of bipartisan legislation to address this. Some of the whereases I'm not too red hot about, but as far as the resolutions are concerned, certainly they state things that there would be unanimity, I think, in agreement. So where are we going with this? What my friend from Illinois has raised is a very small facet, an important facet, but a small facet of what we're going to do, what is the intent of our committee to do going forward in what I think will be a bipartisan fashion. And again, like I said, I hope that we're able to include these, and I welcome the Senator's participation and all members of the Senate's participation as the Foreign Relations Committee does move forward on some comprehensive legislation. But what do we know for sure right now? Well, I think Senator Durbin did an excellent job of taking us through history when it comes to some of the things we've had in the past, like smallpox, AIDS, polio, and Ebola. And certainly the United States has been a leader and will be a leader on this particular scourge. The WHO, and for that matter, other world organizations have been large players, important players, helpful players in those efforts in the past on smallpox, AIDS, polio, and Ebola. And again, I come back to, just as an example, polio. A huge factor in that was not the United States government. Well, they were a huge factor in it, but another huge player in that was a private citizens, a couple in the United States, Bill and Melinda Gates, who played a huge role in eradicating polio, working with the WHO, working with the USG, and many, many others. And I have no doubt as we go forward on this, there will be that type of collaboration in the future. As a good senator noted, this is not a political issue. This is not a Democrat issue. It is not a Republican issue. The virus doesn't care who you are or what you are. It's just looking for a home. And we need to deny it that home, and we will. And I think we will make great strides as we go forward. But what do we know for sure right now? What we know is that this particular virus evolved in China, particularly in Wuhan province, and specifically in a species of bat. What we also know is that there are about 2,000 so far identified viruses that are in the same position, that are carried by bats in the Wuhan province. What we also know is that a virus has escaped from China before. And there is a lot of speculation as to exactly how this happened. We know that the virus jumped species from the bat to a human being and then went around the world. We also know for a fact that this particular virus, like all viruses, act uniquely. It's not exactly the same as other viruses that have jumped species and gone around the world. And this one was unique in that, unlike some of the ones we've had in the past, and this is our sixth experience since 2003 with the virus, unlike those others, this moved around the world at incredibly fast speed. It was much more like a house on fire than the other diseases that we've talked about, like smallpox or polio. Its speed was unique. It was new. It was different. And as a result of that, historical organizations that have dealt with these in the past were not expecting it and were not geared for it. They thought that this virus would move much like the others that we've dealt with. And the result of that, of course, was that it got away from us, from the world, and we now find ourselves in the position we're in because that happened. It's my hope, and it is my objective, and hopefully will be the objective of our committee, eventually the objective of the United States Senate, and hopefully eventually the objective of the world, that we develop a protocol for dealing with a virus, or for that matter, any other health challenge that moves at the speed of light and like a house on fire, as opposed to a small creeping thing that we've had in the past and some of the other challenges that we've had. And it's different. There's no doubt it's different. And it's going to have to be dealt with differently, and going to have to be, we're going to have to develop a protocol that does address this speed. And it's going to entail, and this is probably the heaviest lift of all of that we're going to do, it's going to entail governments, the 200 governments around the world, to come together and agree that when something like this happens in their country, instead of covering it up, or instead of making political excuses, or instead of hoping that it's going to go away, that instead they call the fire department. And the fire department will be a new agency, or perhaps even one of the old agencies that we've had that are geared to handle a pandemic that moves at this speed or presents other challenges. The institutions we have just simply aren't geared to do that, which we found out with this epidemic. The institutions dealt, I think, a good example is, as my good friend from Illinois mentioned, the Ebola challenge that we had. The historical institutions, I think, dealt quickly with that and really held down the damage from it, which could have been much, much more worse than what it was. We need to develop protocols for dealing with this. And this is going to be a challenge. There's no question it's going to be a challenge, because politics comes into this simply because governments in the various 200 countries around the world have to deal with this, and when they do deal with it, they have different ways of dealing with it. One of the challenges we have here, as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, I deal with our diplomats who deal with the diplomats from other countries. We deal with them on the committee directly, but since this thing has hit, we haven't had as much direct contact, but our diplomats have continued to have contact. And one of the things that in talking with them, one of the things I find particularly disturbing is I ask, well, are the Chinese, are they humble about this? How are they dealing with this? What's their view of what's happened here? And interestingly enough, they take it as an opportunity to compare our form of government to their form of government. And they say, look, we had a problem, we dealt with it. You guys had the same problem, and you dealt with it, and you couldn't. And the reason is because we have this strong authoritarian central government that can control people and can control people in the most severe fashion, and we can deal with it. You people with all these freedoms in your democracies, you have speech, you have these political arguments, you have these disagreements, and you allow dissent. And when you have that, you can't deal with it. Therefore, our form of government is better than your form of government. That is very, very dangerous talk. And I'm disturbed and disappointed that the Chinese government have viewed this as they have, and have not viewed it as we have, as a challenge that is going to take historical changes as we go forward. That is a huge challenge as we go forward, but that shouldn't stop us from making every effort that we can to go forward. And we will. On the Foreign Relations Committee, it is our intent to hold hearings, to deliberate, as the U.S. Senate does, and to produce what hopefully will be a bipartisan piece of legislation, which is substantially broader than what we have here, but hopefully that will include many of the things that we have here, and that will include, as the good senator from Illinois has indicated, the necessity of including other governments in the effort as we go forward. And so I commit to you, Senator, and I commit to all, that our committee will undertake this challenge. It is within the jurisdiction and the responsibility of our committee. We take it seriously. We're still in the throes of this, although it feels like we're on the downhill side and we're starting to come out of this. But as we go forward in a very common sense, deliberative fashion, we hope to construct legislation that will address all of these very serious issues. Because if there's one thing we know for sure, and I'm absolutely convinced of it, that this is going to happen again. Given the physical situations on the ground in Wuhan, China, given the fact that there are 2,000 other viruses, probably some of which are substantially worse than this, and for that matter, the same situation in other parts of the world, this is going to happen again, given the population of the world and given the population of, or given the culture, the way we live today in the world and our travel and interconnectedness. This is going to happen again. We need to be ready for it, and we need strong legislation that will address this, not only at the U.S. level, but also at the international level. The United States has been the world leader in world health issues, and I anticipate that we will continue to be like that. But at the present time, it is under consideration in our committee. So at the present time, we really can't go forward with this. Before I state an objection, I want to yield to my good friend from Indiana, who also has some ideas in this regard, and all of which will be, I'm sure, constructive on both sides of the aisle. So I want to yield the floor to Senator BRAUN at this time. Not yet. Thank you, Senator. Senator, I want to yield to Senator BRAUN.
Madam President,
The senator from Indiana.
I object, but my colleague from Illinois is not wrong. And I think after I get through explaining my objection, hopefully there'll be something we can work out. The U.S. should be engaging more in global efforts to find treatments and vaccines for coronavirus. Governments, academic institutions, scientists, researchers across the world are racing to do it. The U.S. must work at home and with international partners to develop treatments and vaccines. There is no reason we can't be doing something on our own in working with others across the world. This is a joint venture if there ever has been one. However, the non-binding resolution that my colleague has offered is not an actual solution. I come from the world, and one of the frustrations of being here for just a year and a half is that we don't get more stuff across the finish line. I have a real solution to ensure Americans benefit from the vaccine and treatment development efforts happening across the world. My bill, the ADAPT Act, Senate Bill 658, as amended, would create an expedited, almost automatic approval process at the FDA for vaccines and treatments that might occur across the world. We do not have the market cornered on good ideas. These countries have all developed regulatory systems that are compatible and that should make us feel comfortable. But instead of just talking about it, which we do so much of here, this bill would actually establish the approval reciprocity for treatments and vaccines between the FDA and other trusted counterparts. If one of them approves a vaccine or treatment, they are quickly, almost automatically approved here in the U.S. with my bill. We cannot afford miscommunication or bureaucratic foot-dragging with something so important. My bill ensures that regulators will work proactively to get Americans a vaccine as soon as possible. Look at the early testing missteps we did have with the CDC. I mentioned that in the briefing last Tuesday. Their overly prescriptive approach delayed our testing capability for the first 40 days. And the result has been a one-size-fits-all approach of locking down the economy, which I think we'll see some of the disadvantages of that over the next few months. When my staff talked to the FDA about working with international partners on treatment and vaccine development, the FDA assured them that they have everything under control and are speaking with their international counterparts. The FDA assured my staff that they have covered the issues that might come into play when you are having a partnership with somebody else. FDA is promoting the idea and having the doors open for developers to submit data and to seek approval for treatments and vaccines. Until we have a vaccine, reopening will be gradual. We need herd immunity and vaccines to be the final solution to this saga we're going through. But we cannot afford bureaucratic obstacles slowing down regulatory approvals for a successful vaccine. As we have seen, certain steps of vaccine development can be achieved at warp speed to cut down on development time, but regulatory approvals will not be one of them unless we take legislative action. The ADAPT Act is real action, not just talk, specifically designed for times like this, when scientists across the world are racing to develop treatments and vaccines. Therefore, with my prior objection, I do not want to leave my friend from Illinois empty-handed. In hoping my colleague from Illinois will not object, Madam President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Help Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-658 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the BRAUN substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, the bill as amended be considered, read a third time, and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. Madam President,
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
first let me say to my friend and colleague from Idaho, thank you. The tone of your remarks was positive, constructive, bipartisan. That's exactly what the American people are looking for, at least in Illinois, and I'll bet you in Idaho as well. This national emergency, this public health crisis, should bring out the best in us, not the most political side of our nature. And thank you, because I think your remarks were offered in that respect. We've been here now 3 weeks. This is the third week since returning from a break where most of us were at home. I think this is the longest period of debate on the coronavirus that we've witnessed on the floor of the Senate in 3 weeks. I thought this 3-week period would be all about COVID-19, all about the vaccine. It hasn't. We've taken up many other things that had nothing to do with it. But what we've talked about here this morning is encouraging to me. And if bringing this resolution up with a unanimous consent request is going to lead to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and other committees really moving forward on the important policy questions that you raised, and I hope I raised as well, then it was not time wasted. It was time well spent. And we do agree on so much more than we disagree. I'm sure of it when it comes to this. So I invite you, I encourage you, I beg you, as soon as we return from next week's recess, the sooner we can bring a hearing before your committee and others, the better. I'd like to address my colleague from Indiana's unanimous consent request as well. It's been my good fortune in the House and the Senate to work with the Food and Drug Administration. It is probably one of the most underrated agencies of our federal government. They make decisions, literally life and death decisions, every single day on things that are unimaginable to us. It's hard to look at all of the things they regulate and inspect and not be impressed. I've been impressed over the years with the Food and Drug Administration. But the gold standard of the Food and Drug Administration, which was established at least 60 years ago with the thalidomide scandal, was that this agency was to take a look at drugs that were about to go on the market in America and conduct test, ask questions, do their own research to determine two things. Are they safe and are they effective? Safe and effective, that's it. But it's a lot. And so over the years, for 60 years or more, they have used this standard to judge drugs, clinical trials, which carefully measure the impact of a drug on the human body over a period of time and the like. It is frustrating because at times it takes longer than we'd wished. There are exceptions that have been created at the Food and Drug Administration for extraordinary circumstances where they can accelerate the process. But by and large, they have to judge drugs as safe and effective. Today, nearly 3/4 of drugs are approved in the United States by the Food and Drug Administration before they're approved in any other country around the world. The FDA is considered the gold standard. I've been told that so many times. And many countries look to the Food and Drug Administration in the United States to see if they approved of a drug as being safe and effective before they move forward. This demonstrates that the Food and Drug Administration has an awesome responsibility, but is doing a good job in ensuring Americans have timely access to the same drugs as patients in other countries. The ADAPT Act, which Senator Braun brings to the floor, is a solution, I believe, in search of a problem. And sadly, it runs a real risk. This notion that we are somehow going to open up the possibility of a drug approved in another country being approved in the United States quickly or without any review, I think is a dangerous thing to do. To date, we know what the coronavirus has done to us, and we also know that this bill would completely change how drugs are approved for sale in the United States of America. It is not a minor bill, it is a major change. Under current law, if a pharmaceutical company wants to sell a drug, it needs the approval of the FDA. They look to test it and to be sure that it's safe and effective. It is the gold standard. Your proposal would abolish this method. That is significant. Instead, your proposal says that if a drug has been approved by another developed country, I'm not sure your definition of a developed country, but if approved by another developed country, it can bypass standard U.S. regulation and come to market without going through the Food and Drug Administration study, review, and approval. It is worth noting that many members of the House and Senate have criticized the pharmaceutical industry for charging Americans the highest drug prices in the world. I've been in that chorus from time to time, and suggested that drug prices in the United States should be the same as they are in Canada and Europe for the same drugs. Many times people on your side of the aisle have resisted that suggestion. They called it socialism and said we shouldn't let other countries dictate what America has to pay for drugs. But now apparently Senator Braun is comfortable letting other countries dictate whether our drugs are safe and effective. This bill is not a targeted response to coronavirus. It's an open-ended giveaway to some pharmaceutical operations, and more importantly, it is putting our safety at risk in America, which we never, ever want to do. Instead of approving a resolution that I introduced that simply expresses support for global coordination, Senator Braun wants to completely overturn our nation's drug approval process. This bill was introduced more than a year ago. It is still in search of a co-sponsor, and it hasn't been considered by the Republican Health Committee, which oversees the FDA. Now is the time for the best and brightest from all nations to work together toward a shared goal of ending this pandemic and finding a safe and effective vaccine. It is not the time to completely upend our nation's drug approval process, making it easy for some countries to flood our market with unsafe and ineffective drugs. For these reasons, I object to Senator Braun's counterproposal.
Madam President.
The objection is heard for both unanimous consent requests. The senator from Indiana is recognized.
So, in maybe a rare moment of some collegiality on the idea in general, I think the American public, and especially myself as one that watched this place operate for so many years leading up to the point where I ran for Senate, I accept the kind of guidance that there may need to be more fleshed out. You objected to it. But I think the American public deserves action out of this place, and so often it seems we dawdle and do not get to the point. Looking how long it took the body to come to agreement on criminal justice reform, and when I asked one of the first questions when I got here, I said, how long had you been working on it? 10 to 12 years. When you look at what we do get accomplished here, I think we need to figure out how we become more effective, we get things done more quickly, and how we pay for it in the long run. So I'm going to savor the moment we have here. We're at least talking about it, and hopefully be able to work with my neighbor from Illinois to still push the idea that this is a critical time and that we need to get something done. I yield the floor.